All right. Can you guys hear me now? All right. Very good. Am I repeating infinitely again? Please tell me no. All right. Very good. So, yeah, let's get going here in just a second. Let me do something real quick. Just a second. Let me do something real quick. Just a second. Let me do something real quick. All right. So I am monitoring the chat. If you've got a question for me, drop it in the Twitch chat, and I will get to it, or drop it in the Discord chat. I am monitoring that as well. So yeah, let's get going here. So thanks everyone for joining. Most of you probably know who I am at this point, but just in case, I'm Bradley Hailstorm. I'm the founder of LionWing, and today's stream is the first in a much larger weekly series that we're going to be running called LionWing Talks, where we basically talk about all things LionWing. We'll be going over kind of the status of our games, our Kickstarter games, talking about the projects we're working on currently, maybe dropping some hints about what we've got in store for you all in the future. But more importantly, we will be answering your questions. LionWing Talks was kind of born out of this idea that I wanted to better communicate with the LionWing community, and I wanted you all to feel like you had a direct line to me to ask me questions. Certainly, you can do that pretty much at any point in the Discord. I'm on Discord pretty much all day long, and I try to respond to every question that I see. I'm sure I miss some here and there, but I really try to keep up on the chat and monitoring the chat just in case someone does have a question for me. But LionWing Talks is also a way, if you're not in the Discord, because plenty of people who back our projects and who buy our stuff are not in the Discord, it's a way for those folks to also catch up with me and to not only get news about LionWing stuff, but to yeah, to ask their questions that they might have on their mind. You can always drop your questions to us through social and all of that too. But LionWing Talks is a great way to also get me to commit to answering your questions. So if you submit a question to me, I will answer it in the upcoming show. So we're doing this on a Thursday tonight, but typically I would be doing this on a Wednesday. So for instance, next week, episode 2 of LionWing Talks will take place Wednesday, not Thursday, Wednesday at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So yeah, it's a little different this week. I'm jumping on a Thursday just because it better coincides with the launch of Embryo Machine. So anyway, so yes, let's talk about some stuff. We've got a lot to cover. Pull up my notes here. So you probably know by now, or if you don't, I'm going to tell you, we've got a Kickstarter that's going on right now. It is live. It's about 2 days old now. I think we've been on for, I don't know, about 60 hours or so. We've been live for about 60 hours. And we're off to a great start, very strong start. I'm excited about where Embryo is going to go. We've got some super cool stretch goals lined up for y'all. We've already unveiled 3 because we've unlocked the first 2 already. We're working on our third one, which is the inclusion of a new map. And then the first 2 stretch goals were the inclusions of 2 new modes. So that was really important to me when we were kind of outlining what the stretch goals would be. I really wanted to add value to Embryo. And one of the ways to do that was by offering more play options. So we're doing a solo mode and then a mission mode. If you read the update last night that I posted around 11, then you kind of already got the rundown of why we chose those things and what all they will offer. So check that out. Check that out if you haven't already. I typically post my updates around 10 to 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just because that's when like my house stops being chaotic and my kids are asleep and my dog's asleep. So it's my only time to kind of get away and clear my head and kind of string together words in some fashion of coherency. So that's why the the updates kind of come later in the day. All right. So that being said, so far we've had some great turnout for Embryo Machine, which is awesome. Lots of enthusiasm, lots of fantastic folks engaging on the Discord, engaging in the comments section, giving us good feedback, giving us good suggestions. Always appreciate the kind words that people have for the game for us. That's awesome. I know big shout out to Storm in the Discord and Sin Theory. Appreciate you guys, engaging and talking about Embryo Machine as much as you have. And big shout out to James over on the campaign page. I won't give his full name. I don't know if he wants that, but he put together a really awesome YouTube video yesterday, kind of doing a deep dive on the game, and that was completely, out of nowhere. It's not like we had reached out to him to ask him to do that or anything. He took it upon himself to put together like a 17-minute deep dive, which was awesome of him. Thanks, James. I appreciate it, and appreciate your enthusiasm. So yeah. I'm going to go over some embryo questions that folks have asked, and then I'll kind of circle back and talk about Embryo Machine in a more general sense, but I want to get to the questions first. I should say that LionWing Talks, it's going to cover a wide variety of games. We're not just going to talk about one particular game. I mean, there might be some days where we do a deep dive on something and it might just happen to be one game, but most of the time we're going to talk about all of our games. Tonight will be embryo heavy, obviously. I mean, for obvious reasons. So I want to get to some of those Embryo Machine questions, but then we've had plenty of questions in the Discord and elsewhere that I will answer as well. So of course, a question that has come up a lot during the time that we've been live is, is there any chance of any resin kits, actual 3D models, miniatures for the game as an add-on or something? And the answer is no, not right now. That's not really in our plans. The Embryo, it never had miniatures to begin with. We weren't even going to include the digital STL files. But that was kind of like a late game call that I made because I did see folks in the Facebook ads commenting that it'd be great to have miniatures. So I said, you know what? I'm not like in the business of doing miniatures. I'm not all that interested in being like a miniatures company. That's just not my thing. That's not really what LionWing does. But I personally like miniatures, and I know a lot of other people like miniatures, and I think the art lends itself really well in Embryo Machine to miniatures. So I thought, well, I mean, I'm not going to offer miniatures, but I can offer something else. I can offer some sort of compromise, and so that's when we thought, well, we'll do the STL files. That's cool. And I've been watching kind of our backer report, and a lot of people have picked up those STL files. So thank you. That's awesome. But yeah, so I mean, Embryo Machine isn't like a miniatures game. It's a small form, compact, accessible game. The boards aren't like the battlefields aren't very big. So that's it's one of the reasons why the game never had miniatures to begin with, even in Japan. Now, part of it was kind of a space-saving measure, but the other part of it is, while you can certainly use miniatures, and I'm going to have miniatures printed, I don't necessarily know if I will be playing with those all the time, because I really do like the Standies. I think our acrylic Standies are going to be super sharp. They're double-sided. They're full color, about 2 inches tall. Which is about the same size as the cardboard Standies, which I have behind me. But nevertheless, Embryo Machine just isn't. It's not a miniatures game. That's not the type of game that it is. And I know people want it to be that game. I know people want it to be that type of game, but it's not. And I don't know if I really have much else to say about that. So. If you do want minis, though, like we've got that STL option, and hopefully you check that out. I'm really excited that we were able to offer that. So we've basically got 3 levels of pieces for folks. If you just want to get in, you just want the game, and you don't really care about components too much, then you can go for the cardboard Standies. I mean, they're thick Standies, pretty thick Standies. They're of good quality. They're not going to bend or break on you. So we've got that. We've got that level, then we've got our upgraded acrylic Standies, and then we've got the STL option. So we got a little bit of something for everyone, which was kind of my plan, especially when I committed to the STL digital files. I really wanted to try to be as accommodating of folks' needs and wants as I could be, without, of course, having to produce miniatures. It's just miniatures. It's a logistical nightmare. It can slow down projects. It can delay projects. It can take a project that is super fantastic looking with a great presentation and and high quality components. And if you don't get the miniatures just right, you've kind of just shit on your game entirely. And I'm not willing to do that. I'm not willing to take that chance. I'm not willing to mess up the rest of the game for 9 miniatures. So so that's that. Another question that we've gotten is, are the acrylic standees double-sided? And as I mentioned before, they are. We did that for two reasons. One, I hate single-sided acrylic standees, just like it's a personal thing. I don't like it. But also, we kind of needed the double-sided standee because positioning an Embryo Machine is super important. It's important to know where the front and the back of your machine is. It's important to know which way you're facing. And so having that visual reference point to know which is the back and which is the front of your mech is important. So the double-sided standee was born out of necessity. You can see here, you've got the full color on one side, and then you've got this gray tone, this grayscale model on the back to indicate that this is the back of your standee. So I don't know how well that showed up on the camera, but nevertheless. So yeah, they are double-sided. Some other questions that we have gotten. This isn't directly related to the Embryo Machine board game we're producing, but it is related to Embryo Machine, and that is a question that came from Nova. And that was, does anyone know if an English version of the Embryo Machine tabletop RPG has been produced? So the answer to that is no. For those who aren't aware, Embryo Machine is it's an 11-year-old property. The series started as a tabletop role-playing game from Group S&E. If you have followed the Japanese tabletop RPG scene, then you probably know about Group S&E. I mean, they're a big deal over there. And so they actually produced the first Embryo Machine game through it was a TTRPG. And then at some point, so they produced a bunch of expansions and replay books for Embryo, the tabletop role playing game. But at some point, I think people were like, "So this tabletop RPG is super cool, but like, can we just have the combat? Like, the combat's what we really like." And so Group S&E partnered with Mosaic, kind of knowing Mosaic's pedigree, to create the board game version of it. And so thus Embryo Machine, the board game, was born. So yeah, so no one's produced an English version of the tabletop RPG, but I mean, you know. Moving on, someone also said in the comment section of the campaign page, SRW the board game, which yes, that it totally is. SRW meaning Super Robot Wars, which is a video game series that dates back quite a long time, where they mash up all of these different anime licenses that are based around mechs and put them all into one strategy RPG. And usually they're fantastic games. They really are, and they span multiple platforms. But it's SRW games are fantastic, not just because the gameplay is super cool and the animations are super awesome, especially some of the newer ones like V, T, and X, but and even Moon Dwellers. But it's always fun to play a Super Robot Wars game just to figure out how convoluted the storyline can get, because they got to take all these mechs from all these different franchises. Yeah, they and they have to try to fit it all into to a coherent narrative, and it never really is a coherent narrative, because like, how coherent of a narrative can you really have when you're trying to combine Gundam, Full Metal Panic, Code Geass, Votoms, and like Gurren Lagann? None of it makes sense, but I think everyone just kind of accepts it for what it is and realizes that it's a badass game without it really making that much sense storyline wise. Although some of the newer games have actually, I think, worked a little bit harder to have a coherent narrative. The original Super Robot Wars that do not pull in any of the licensed properties, the OG games, I love their stories. But I'm digressing. No one showed up to talk about Super Robot Wars. I just had to nerd out about SRW for a minute. So thank you, Sam, who made that comment. So yeah, that's where we're at with Embryo Machine right now. We are going to be posting a, a preview track from the game's OST in tonight's update. So I'm going to be posting an update pretty much right when I get off of here. And I chose to use tonight's update for a soundtrack preview because I realized a lot of people have pledged to the Ace tier, which includes the soundtrack, and a lot of people who've pledged to the Pilot tier, which is kind of like the base game pledge tier, have added on the soundtrack. So clearly there's interest in the soundtrack. And so we wanted to show off that a little bit. We're using the same composer that we used for Testament and Wild Hunt Festival. Now, the cool part about this soundtrack is it's very different from anything that we've done for any of our previous games. I mean, Testament and Wild Hunt Festival are they're fantasy games, and so they sound very much like a JRPG. Whereas, this soundtrack for Embryo is a lot more driving. It When I had told Kosaic that we produce soundtracks for our board games, I think their initial response was like, "What? Why do you do that?" But it's just kind of like it's something that I like. It's something that is sort of synonymous with what we do now. I love soundtracks for all types of media. I remember being a kid and getting the soundtrack for Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, which was just a book, but I needed to have that soundtrack. So, like, soundtracks are near and dear to my heart. And so when I opened up LionWing, I kind of told myself, hey, when the time is right, we're going to start doing soundtracks for our games. Nevertheless, once I think Kosaic got over the fact that it was kind of weird we were producing a soundtrack for their board game, they were kind of all in and were like, yeah, so I asked them what are the inspirations for the game because I want to be able to pull from those as much as possible and have our composer try to hit some of those notes that you would hear in some of the soundtracks that would have influenced Embryo Machine. And so they came back and said Gundam, of course, as you might imagine, but also Armored Core. 0083 specifically for Gundam. And so I went and just listened to like every Gundam soundtrack and Armored Core soundtrack I could get my hands on through Spotify and YouTube, and then kind of compiled some reference tracks, threw in some Damon Cross Machina stuff, and sent it to the composer Gio, and was like, "Hey, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's the vibe of the game. Can you like put some stuff together?" And he was like, "Oh yeah, sure." And it turned around like 4 days later and was like, "Hey, here's your first track. What do you think? Give me feedback. I'll make some revisions." And I was like, "Don't make any revisions. That track is staying as it is." So we're showing off that track tonight. Normally with our soundtracks, we start with what's going to be the trailer track for our Kickstarters, but this we worked in reverse because our trailer was not finished yet. And I like to have the composer score the trailer track to the actual trailer. And since we didn't have the trailer, we had to kind of move on. And so the track that we're showing off tonight is called The War Grinder, and it's super rad. So that's what we're showing off tonight. All right, so let's get to some more questions, some general questions. So I might come back and I might talk about Embryo Machine some more in this conversation, but I think I've kind of covered everything that I've needed to cover. We are next week. I and the graphic designer on the localization of Embryo Machine are going to do another live stream, and we're going to talk about the localization process behind Embryo Machine, why we made the choices we made with the visual presentation, the visual changes, the wording changes, in some cases some layout changes. We did that for our last Kickstarter, Gun and Gun, and people seemed to really dig it. So I figured, hey, we'll bring it back for this one as well. Embryo, though, I will say was a far more straightforward localization than Gun and Gun was. Gun and Gun was very challenging, and certainly every localization project, especially in the board game industry, is challenging, just because you've got limited real estate to work with, on cards and on boxes and whatnot. So every project is challenging when it comes to localization, but Embryo was certainly less challenging than Gun and Gun. Now, that doesn't mean it was easy. It was not. It was not easy. But it was different than Gun and Gun. So we are going to be doing that stream next week. I think I've got a schedule for that somewhere around, but I don't have it on me right now. I'll be posting that schedule to the Kickstarter page later in the week, probably, or early next week. Nevertheless, all right, so let's get to some questions, because I know people have asked questions and they want to hear my answers to them. I'll also give some updates on some of our projects. I'll do that at the end. I just saw Locksmith's comment. Thanks. Appreciate the kind words for the shirt. I'm a Dreamcast kid. So, all right, let me get to general questions here. Okay, so we're going to pivot away from Embryo Machine for a little bit. First question from the Discord. You just ordered one yourself? Yeah. It's on the Sega store. So the Sega shop for North America is finally like legitimate. For a while, like only the Sega of Europe shop was like had decent. Yeah, they do have some great stuff, but for the longest time they had trash. It was just Sega Europe that like had all the awesome stuff, and I wasn't willing to pay the import fees. You know, the crazy high shipping rates. So when I finally realized, like, oh, okay, Sega of America's shop is starting to pick up the pace. You know, there's some really awesome stuff on there. There was a Jet Set Radio shirt that I wanted, that I'll probably go back to at some point. Anyway. So this comes from Sai in the Discord. He said, "I'm curious as to how the future of LionWing is envisioned, specifically about two topics. One, the number of releases, and then he says, you mentioned before about having a guideline for when to switch to the next project. Do you intend to keep that schedule for as long as applicable, or are you trying to ramp up? And then the follow-up question was, how do non-Kickstarter games fit into this schedule? And then the last question is the current niche anime games from Japan locked in, or would you be open to expanding as time goes on? You know, non-anime Japanese games, non-Japanese games in general, originals, redesigns, et cetera, et cetera. So these are good questions. Awesome questions. I appreciate it. Lot to unpack there. So in the past, we have only revealed the next project, the next Kickstarter project, once the previously funded project has gone to the printer. That's been sort of my rule, that we're not going to talk about anything until I know everything's squared away with the current project. You know, because I don't want to screw over the folks who just backed our previous project by saying, yeah, we're not quite done with that, but oh, hey, we're moving on to a new project. I don't want to be that company. I don't think most people want to be that company or are that company, but I certainly don't want LionWing to be like that. I do think now that we've been doing this a lot more, you know, 2020 was a weird year for Planet Earth, but it was an all right year for LionWing as a business, and it was a chance for LionWing to kind of find its footing. You know, we've been around since summer of 2018, but 2020 was like kind of our breakout year. That's when I really kind of buckled down and really got serious about LionWing and LionWing's mission and producing the games that we've produced thus far. So I mention all of that to ultimately say, yes, that's been my rule in the past. I will say though that we have refined our process a little bit more. So we're a lot more streamlined. You know, now that we've got multiple projects under our belt, we kind of have a better rhythm about how we need to do things, how we need to communicate, and hitting our deadlines. And so, for the time being, the process will probably stay the same, of where we will reveal the next project once the previous one is ready to go, you know, off to the printer. But you know, I mean, I'm not going to like lock in that is the only way that we can do things. I think in this business you have to be flexible. I think that's important. You have to be able to pivot sort of on a dime sometimes, depending on what's being demanded of you, either by the market or by you know, your audience. And I will say that 2021 is like 2020 is also going to be a pretty aggressive year for LionWing, more aggressive than 2020 was. So we launched 2 solo Kickstarters in 2020, Karate Wild Hunt Festival in the summer, and then Gun and Gun in the fall. And then we co-launched a project in February for Testament. But really the only 2 games that were fully ours that we kind of ran the Kickstarters for and everything, you know, were Wild Hunt Festival and Gun and Gun. So it was only two projects. 2021 is going to be different. We're looking at least double that in terms of projects. So Embryo Machine obviously is our first Kickstarter of 2021. It will not be our last Kickstarter though, and we will have more Kickstarters in 2021 than we did in 2020. And in 2021, we will have our first non-Kickstarter project that we'll be launching. And we're going to be launching that through a pre-order campaign that we're dubbing LionWing First. The LionWing First program is it's kind of like bringing Kickstarter a little bit to our own web store. We're revamping our website. We're finally setting up an actual web store. So our pre-order campaign for this particular game that will not be a Kickstarter game will when you pre-order it, you will get incentives just like you would when you backed one of our Kickstarter campaigns. You'll get exclusive items that will only be available if you pre-order the game. And it'll be cool stuff, you know? It'll be either additional content, be that promo characters, promo art, deluxe components, or it might be, or it might be kind of like some secondary merchandise, keychains and whatnot. We'll talk more on that as we get closer to that. That's a little bit down the road. Right now, my focus is just on Embryo Machine and our next immediate project. I mean, the truth is we're juggling like 4 projects right now. But I myself am really only kind of heavily involved in Embryo Machine, obviously, because the Kickstarter is running, and we're still kind of tightening things up there, not with the Kickstarter, but with the game, and then the project that'll come after Embryo. So yeah, the schedule that we've been adhering to may change. It may have to change, honestly, because 2021 is going to be we're going to have to adhere to some pretty rigorous timelines. And so that might mean announcing some games prior to when we have in the past, but I really want to try to make sure that we do our due diligence with the game that came before the one we're announcing. You know what I mean? I think that's super important. Let's see here. Let me make sure I answered all the questions. Is the current niche anime games from Japan locked in, or would you be open to expanding that as time goes on? Certainly, I don't want to ever lock us into one particular niche or one particular corner of the market. But you know, if I'm being honest, I like anime games from Japan. You know, so my motto is with LionWing stuff, like if I don't like it, then I don't want to publish it. So I really only publish games that I like, which maybe that's the wrong way to do things. But it's the way that it's worked out for me so far. And I like anime games from Japan. So we're probably going to stay with anime games from Japan for a while. I do think it's important to build brand identity. You don't want to fracture your brand identity, you know, too soon in your company's life. But you know, there are games that I am interested in that don't have as heavy of theming as some of the games that we've produced thus far, or may not lean as heavily into the anime aesthetic. And I'll never rule those things out because I like a lot of those games too. I just happen to like anime games from Japan a little bit more, and so we're definitely open to moving beyond that. But I can only really talk about what's like in our immediate queue, and right now it's a lot of anime games from Japan. But yeah, as time goes on, would we look at non-Japanese games or originals or redesigns? Sure, yeah. I'm definitely open to that at some point. I mean, I'm always open to talk about those things. If someone has a great idea right now and they're not Japanese and their game's not from Japan, and they say, hey, I've got this idea, I kind of want to run it by you, see if you'd be interested. And I'm always willing to have that conversation. There are there are fantastic designers all over the damn world, you know? And I don't want to shut anyone out in that regard. So I would always listen to that conversation. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, maybe down the road, it makes a little bit more sense to look at incorporating some of those things. I think that tends to be sort of the natural progression of most companies anyway, at least in this line of work. So yeah, I don't mean to hedge on all of these answers, but as we're just beginning to sort of find ourselves as a company, I also don't want to lock us into one thing, even though that one thing, which typically is anime games from Japan, are the things that I really like. And that people seem to really like. Not enough folks are bringing those games, to the West. That's why I started LionWing in the first place, was to bring more exposure to all the fantastic games that never left Japan. And a lot of the fantastic games that I personally tend to gravitate toward are those with that clean anime aesthetic. Okay, so another question, actually from the same Discorder. He says, I'm also curious about your vision of the candidate pool. Are you still new where you can cherry pick? Okay, are you? As you are still new, you can cherry pick from a lot of the backlog in Japan. Going forward, do you think you will outpace the release rate of unlocalized good anime Japanese games, or is the market vibrant enough that you will never be able to localize all of the titles you want to? Yeah, so if we go back 5, 6 years, there would probably be a time that probably would have been a time where you could outpace yourself a little bit. Maybe not 5 or 6 years, maybe like 10 years. Um, I think there was a time when you could maybe outpace yourself in terms of like quality games that would translate well to a Western audience. A game can be fantastic, but if it's not going to be fantastic for your new localized audience, then it's not a fantastic game for your new localized audience, and so therefore you probably don't want to pick that one up. Doesn't mean that game is any less fantastic. It just means that there are factors at play that allow it to perform in one territory and not the other. Nevertheless, there are a lot more anime Japanese games coming out of Japan now than there were, 5, 6, 7, definitely 10 years ago. Even the past 3 years, I'm always scouting. And so I feel like I've got my finger on the pulse in that regard. And just watching things since LionWing came into fruition, there's been a ramping up process. There's a lot more anime games to choose from, a lot of really good ones. So at this point, no, I don't worry about outpacing what Japan is able to produce, because there are so many good games out right now, and more great games will continue to come out. That I could never localize all those games. Even the companies that share this same corner of the industry together, we couldn't localize all those games. I mean, there really are that many good quality games coming out of Japan, and good quality anime games coming out of Japan. So I don't worry about that so much anymore. Perhaps there was a time to worry about that, but in 2021 going forward, I don't think we have to worry about that, which is exciting. There's just so much awesome stuff coming out, it's just really exciting. Okay, this question comes from Sword Rhapsody. In one of your interviews, you talked about the possibility of non-Kickstarter projects. Can you talk about what that'll look like exactly? So I mentioned this before. We're going to be launching our first one this year. We're going to do a pre-order campaign with some pre-order exclusives. That game is going to be a smaller game. Certainly, sometimes small games still make sense for Kickstarter. Some of our games haven't been super huge games. In fact, our very first game, Sinome Coliseum R, was not a very big game. But even still, it made sense for Kickstarter. But sometimes, a game is so small where it doesn't feel right to put it on Kickstarter, and there's not a lot you could do with it on Kickstarter. You know what I mean? I mean, there are certain built-in expectations that folks have, myself included, when they go to back a project, and that is that you're going to get, hopefully, additional content through stretch goal unlocks, and also you're going to have some really cool options when it comes to your pledge tiers, which tend to include some additional content or secondary merchandise. But some games they're so small that you can't really provide any of that, or it's a game where the designer has said, this is a standalone game. I don't really have any more interest in kind of offering anything else for this game. Like, take it or leave it as it is. It's one of those situations. And those are the types of games that make sense for our LionWing First program. And the game that we'll be revealing, later on in the year certainly fits that mold. Um, so that's kind of what that'll look like. Hopefully I answered your question. And Sword Rhapsody had another one here. Oh, also, I've been doing some. This must have been before the campaign went live, but I'll answer it anyway. I've been doing some reading on Embryo Machine. Do you think you'll host a digital league like you plan to do with Gun and Gun? Yeah, so that's the plan. For as long as we're in this pandemic, we're going to be offering the LionWing uh, virtual league, in which we will be utilizing Discord and cameras to play matches of Gun and Gun and Embryo Machine, and we're going to be running a league, and the league will run for however long. There'll be standings, um, leaderboard, that kind of thing. There'll be prizes, um, some cool exclusive content that you'll be able to earn from participating in those leagues. So we're really excited about this. I mean, so I'll talk about Gun and Gun for a second. When I had, when I was talking with Keep Dry about localizing Gun and Gun, this was like long before the pandemic was ever a thing. And so we had already signed the contract and had already gotten to work on Gun and Gun when COVID hit. And so, it dawned on me, at that point, the Kickstarter was still like 7 months away, because all the stuff hit in March. We knew we weren't launching the Kickstarter until October. And I remember having a conversation with the team of like, all right, so is this something we even still want to do? Like, we're trying to, we're trying to sell a competitive card game at a time when you can't get together with anyone, or at least you can't get together with a lot of people. You're not going to have in-store events. Is this still a good idea? And some people were like, yeah, maybe not such a good idea, Bradley. And I was like, yeah, maybe, but I think actually there's a way that we could still do this, and for it to make sense, and for people to still have that kind of communal experience that you would get by going to your, FLGS, and you're going to play Gun and Gun across the table in a store. We can do that through Discord. Yes, it's not the same. It never will be the same, and I'm not trying to make it the same, but I'm trying to offer something. And that was my compromise of, hey, this is how we offer something. And perhaps we could have done it through like Tabletop Simulator or whatever, but I wanted people to actually use their games, so you, the folks who backed Gun and Gun, you're going to get your stuff in May, and I want you to be able to like play the game. I don't want you to then like shelve the game and then say, okay, when I'm going to go play the Tabletop Simulator version of it. Like that, to me, that just wouldn't be a whole lot of fun. I want to use the thing that I just paid money for, that I'm finally getting after waiting however many months to get it. And so that's when, I kind of made that executive decision to say, no, we're going to do this kind of old fashioned with cameras and actual cards. And yes, that's going to present some unique problems that would not be present if we were running something through Tabletop Simulator, but I'm not sure I care, because I want the experience of like real life people, real life components, and engaging in that way to try to, bridge that gap as much as possible of, not being able to play in person any longer in stores, but still being able to play the game that you want to play with another human being. And so running things through Discord was kind of the way that I thought we'd do that. Sin Theory just said, just getting to play with the physical cards, I think, is something that makes it feel better. Yeah, it totally does. At least it does to me. It's not the same when you're playing, through Tabletop Simulator. It's just not. It might be easier, but easier is not always better. At least I didn't think so in this case. And so we are going to be doing the same thing for Embryo Machine. Now, fortunately, Embryo Machine will have the benefit of coming out at a time when hopefully things are beginning to look a little bit more like the life we once knew. And so it'll be closer to being able to be played in person than Gun and Gun. Obviously, Gun and Gun releases 6-7 months before Embryo Machine is set to arrive at backers' doorsteps. So, but even still, even though hopefully by December and early 2022, God, it's hard to think that next year's 2022. This past year has felt like a decade. Hopefully, though, hopefully we'll be a little bit closer to getting out of this thing, but we'll probably still not be fully out of it. And so I want to be able to offer something until we are fully out of it. And the LionWing Virtual League, and by association, the Embryo Machine Virtual League, will be a way to do that. So Embryo will be a little bit more challenging just because there's more parts to play. You're not just playing with cards, but we'll get around it. Some other questions here. This came from Mirage Sessions. I think his exact question was, this is because I'm lurking on the anime chat and has nothing to do with LionWing stuff, but Bradley, what's your favorite anime? I hate this question. I hate what's your favorite anything questions, because my favorites will sort of shift depending on the day. Usually I have a decent idea of what a top 5 is, but the order of those top 5 kind of changes with my mood, changes with what's going on in my life sometimes. But also, are you talking about series, or are you talking feature films? I mean, so I guess I'll just answer both in whatever way I can. So we'll start with movies, and then I'll work into the series. I would probably say I could probably rank my movies better than I could series. So I'll attempt to do it. I'll attempt to rank the movies, starting with number 5 and then working my way to number 1. And number 1 would be my favorite of all time. Number 5 is probably Garden of Words. 4, The Girl Who Leapt Through Time. 3, Ghost in the Shell. 2, Perfect Blue. 1, Ninja Scroll. That's probably what that looks like. Series wise, okay, so it's a little harder to put this one together, but I would say, okay, so this is not in any order because I don't know how I could ever rank these things. Although I do know my number 1, but all the others I don't know. I would say the Arc the Lad anime adaptation, which is right back there on my shelf, on my Arc the Lad shelf. Arc the Lad is my favorite game series, and so it's only right that its anime adaptation, while not super stellar, is still in my top 5. And then probably Arslan Sinki, or The Heroic Legend of Arslan, is in there. Full Metal Alchemist, not Brotherhood. I said it. Get over it. I like Brotherhood. Don't get me wrong. And then, I mean, it's kind of bogus having two series from the same franchise in a top 5. That just feels lazy, but I can't help it. I'll go with Gundam Wing, which hasn't, I fully admit, it has not aged super well. It's very much so a product of its time. But then number 1, bar none, is Gundam 8th MS Team, which rivals Ninja Scroll as just kind of my favorite anime anything of all time. I love 8th MS Team. It's more my speed. I like shorter series. I like the focus on soldiers and ground combat more than mechs, despite loving mechs. So I love 8th MS Team. So yeah, there's my answer for you, Mirage. Thanks for the question. I'm sure people really care about what my favorite anime series are. I mean, you do, which is cool. I'm not sure anyone else does though. Okay, and then the last question I have here: what are the challenges in adapting a game in terms of Japanese and English being fundamentally structured differently? Oh, the challenges are vast, for that very reason. So it's interesting. I talked about this in one of our gun and gun videos. Before I mentioned that with board games or tabletop games in general, so that I kind of capture card games as well and everything else that falls into the analog games category. In the tabletop scene, you've only got so much real estate to work with on your components. And going from Japanese to English is particularly challenging because Japanese uses a lot less characters than English does to say the same thing. It takes us forever to say something in English when juxtaposed with Japanese. I mean, it's just, Japanese is just a shorter language, with characters that can encompass multiple words in some ways, multiple meanings, or one character can encompass multiple characters in a sense. We don't have that luxury in English, so it gets tricky, especially depending on the type of Japanese that's used on the card. So, like Gun and Gun, for instance, had a ton of kanji, big kanji, and kanji will use one character to for a single word, and it's just one character. But then that when you translate that to English, it might be like a 10-letter word. And how do you fit a 10-letter word into a space where there was just one kanji character on the card? It's not like you can expand your text area. I mean, you're working with a confined area, whether it's on a card or a board, um, on a rule sheet, whatever the case may be. You've only got so much space. And so it's this delicate balance of making sure that you're very intentional with your wording. Well, first off, making sure you understand the context in which the Japanese is being presented, so that you can then be intentional with the words you choose when you're translating, whatever that text might be. So just working with card real estate, for instance, is one of the most challenging aspects of doing localization in this specific industry. And I do think that that problem, that challenge is specific to this industry. Um, so, I mean, that's hard. Also, you know, Japanese characters just look cooler. It's a flashier language. It's a prettier language. English is so boring. And so a lot of Japanese games, especially the ones that I tend to go for, tend to have very stylized text to them. I mean, Gun is like the poster child for that. I mean, that game was stylized to hell. And then, our job as the localization company was, and the publisher is to say, all right, so how do we maintain the essence, the vibe of this game, knowing that we are working with a language that is a hell of a lot less interesting, in terms of its visual presentation. So then you've got to get creative. You got to get creative with the font that you choose. You got to get creative with the font size that you use. You got to get creative with matching different styles of fonts, um, and how you present that text in a visual way that's interesting. It'll probably never be as interesting as the Japanese lettering was, like with Gun and Gun, but you try to get as close as you can to it. And so that's why I said, um, or if I didn't say, I alluded to, and I certainly said it in one of our earlier Gun and Gun videos, that Gun and Gun was the hardest localization project that I had ever worked on. And I've been working in the localization field for a long time. Before I started LionWing, I was in video games localization, and so I was working on massive games, visual novels, RPGs, MMOs, and yet Gun and Gun was the most challenging out of all the localization projects I've ever worked on. Um, and I mean, hell, I was the lead editor on the Clannad visual novel, and you think a game that sprawling would be the most challenging localization project that I worked on, and no, that just wasn't the case. Gun and Gun kind of took that top prize as being the hardest one. So yeah, I mean, there are real fundamental structural issues that you have to overcome to the best of your ability when you're in this line of work. But that's like it's part of the job. It's not like you don't get another option. Like if you don't want to deal with that kind of thing, this probably isn't the line of work you want to be in. That you probably don't want to be localizing tabletop games then, and you certainly don't want to be localizing tabletop games from Japan, and that's fine. Like some people are like, yeah, no, that's too much work. But I mean, I started the company, especially having localization experience. I kind of knew what I was getting into. Now I didn't know that my localization experience in video games was not going to pair perfectly with localization in tabletop games for the aforementioned reasons, but I at least had kind of a working knowledge of the types of challenges that we were going to come across as a team, and I was prepared, and ready and willing to kind of tackle those challenges as they came to me. So hopefully that answers your question, Ben. Ben submitted that. And I think that's all the questions that we had. A quick update on our previous projects, specifically a Wild Hunt Festival and Gun and Gun. I don't have a lot to say on Testament. Again, we did a partnership with Japanime Games and and they're kind of we mostly were just the localization studio on that, although we are billed as the co-publisher, and certainly we took on some of the tasks and roles of a co-publisher. Mostly for that project, we were the localization studio, and they're handling everything else. So I can't really speak to kind of where that game is and when folks will be getting it as much as I wish I could. Japanime, they're the best folks to reach out to. They're very receptive and fantastic to work with and talk with. So I would just say it if you're one of those folks who and you got to know more about Testament when it comes to like where is it and the logistics behind getting it. They're the ones you want to reach out to once you get the game, and you've got questions about the game itself. Then we're the ones that you want to reach out to. So, but okay, so Wild Hunt Festival. Wild Hunt Festival is done with production. I mentioned in the October one of the October updates for Wild Hunt Festival that printers, international shipping was not only backed up, printers were also backed up because of the pandemic. Less people working, less hours being worked, um, people being out because they're being sick for whatever reason, not necessarily with COVID, but being sick and not knowing if it's COVID or not. So therefore having to stay out longer. And so you had less personnel, less staff. And so therefore orders got backed up on the printing side of things. And of course, everything's backed up when it comes to international shipping, and it still is. Certainly, international shipping has gotten a little bit better actually through January, which is cool. But it's still a fucking nightmare. If I'm being honest, it's a mess still. And I think it's from all indications from us talking with our logistics companies and our freight shipment companies. I think that messiness is going to pretty much be here for all of 2021. So hopefully, though, that means that people will acclimate to these new conditions and will have less delays and that kind of thing. It's also part of the reason why I put out Embryo's target delivery date so far to December. Normally, I probably would have gone for October, but in this environment, you never know if things are going to be delayed by like a week or if they're going to be delayed by like 5 months. I mean, that was kind of the case with Wild Hunt Festival. It's like, okay, yeah, our delivery date is December, and then we talk with everyone, our printer and our logistics company and our fulfillment company, and they're like, yeah, no, you're not getting that in December. And I'm thinking like, oh, okay, well, like January, February, I was already kind of thinking like, we might actually be pushing into January. We might miss our target by about a month. But when they were like, no, we're not. I'm not talking about like 4 weeks. I'm talking about like 20 weeks. So that's the status there. I mean, the good news is production's done on the game. And so now the only thing that we've been talking about is coordination of shipping logistics. So the fact that we're already there is a good sign for hitting our revised delivery date of May. If you've been reading the updates, I mentioned that we are looking more at a May delivery date. And so far, so good in that regard. I mean, we're in early February. The Chinese New Year is coming to an end, and so people will get back to work, and that'll allow us to kind of get back on track. So, but yes, the best news that I can share about Wild Hunt Festival is that production is done, mass production is done, which is great. That is. That used to be the hardest part. Now shipping is the hardest part. I mean, shipping's always been kind of a nightmare, but it's just especially so these days. So that's where we're at with Wild Hunt Festival. We still do have 2 DLCs coming. We delivered our first DLC at the end of December called Endless Winter, which is fantastic. Liner note just knocked it out of the park with that DLC. It's very thematic. It's very narrative heavy. You get a new boss fight. You get a new OST track. You get some print on demand cardboard standees, which we didn't even know about actually. I don't even think I shared that in one of the updates. We Ramosan, his team had just finished up everything, and he sent me an email like, hey, I'm going to send you everything tomorrow. I'm like, okay, cool. So he sends me over the zip file, and he's like, yeah, here's the file. Everything's in there. Just be sure to open it up, make sure everything looks good, and then we're good to go. And so I open it up, and I'm looking at all the files. I'm like, oh yeah, wait, what's this folder? Standies. What's that? So I like click on it, and he included cardboard standees. Didn't even tell me about it. So I went back to him like, dude, you didn't tell me you had standees. This is awesome. And he was like, oh yeah, I guess I didn't. So so yeah, the cardboard standees was a pleasant surprise. That was super cool. I love Liner Note. They just were fantastic to work with, and I think we will be working with them again in the future. And that's all I'll say about that. So that's Wild Hunt Festival. Gun and Gun. So where are we with Gun and Gun? Right now we are. I'm waiting on the production samples. So I mentioned in the update that production samples are not the norm any longer, at least not with our printer, because international shipping is so outrageous. The production samples used to cost, like when I got the production samples for Sonoma Coliseum R, we were using the same printer then as we are now. I think it cost me like $30 to get those. I mean, I had to pay for the actual production samples, which was like $200 or whatever. But this time, I not only had to pay the $200 to get the production samples, but I then had to pay an additional $250 to get them shipped to us. So things are a little different right now in that regard. But nevertheless, I'm waiting on those production samples now. You know, Gun and Gun's going to be interesting. There were a lot more moving parts when it came to the add-on items and pledge tier items than there were for Wild Hunt Festival. Maybe not. Maybe there weren't more items, but there were more things to get right uh, with Gun and Gun. Things have to be very exact with Gun and Gun, and of course they had to be very exact with Wild Hunt Festival too. But it was so much easier to print a collapsible dice tray and custom dice, and for that to look the way you want it to, than it is to, for instance, print a storage box that fits everything the way that you want it to, that looks the way that you want it to, and that is big enough to house all your cards, but not also overly big to where it's going to drive up your shipping costs. I mean, we're already taking a hit on the shipping costs with the storage boxes anyway. We're eating like $5 per shipment on those things. So like, we have to be a lot more precise with Gun and Gun's measurements when it came to the components than any other project. So I'm really curious and excited to get those production samples. I don't know when they're going to get to me, since the Chinese New Year has kind of slowed everything down as it naturally would. I mean, I knew it would. I kind of was anticipating. It might take me a little bit to get those production samples. But so once I get the production samples, if everything looks good, then we're off to mass production, within that same week. If things don't look good, that's where we can hit some slowdowns. That's where we've got to go back and forth with the printer to say, hey, this isn't what we were talking about. This is what we were talking about. And then they have to create a digital mock-up and say, is this what you're talking about? And then we have to say, yes, that is what we were talking about. Hopefully we get to say, yes, that is what we were talking about. Sometimes to send back the digital, sample, we're like, no, that is still not what we're talking about. This would all not be a big issue if there wasn't a time difference. We basically only get one shot to talk with our printing partner a day. Because by the time that we're rolling into bed, they're rolling into work. And so you get one shot at it, which is why the communication process oftentimes is what slows down the whole production cycle. It's not production necessarily. It's just the time lapse. But that's where we're at with Gun and Gun. Things have been proceeding as normal with Gun and Gun. I mentioned we slowed down by about 10 to 12 days at one point because despite following their guidelines to a T with their printing template they sent us, they still were having issues with some of our files. So poor Winona had to produce those files more times than I can count. We finally got it right. And here we are. So I expected this to be like a 30-minute endeavor, and it turned into an hour. I think this will do it for today's episode of LionWing Talks. This is pretty much what you can expect from this, though. If you want to be more involved, please join us on Twitch or Discord. Ask your questions in real time. I'm monitoring the chat. I will get to all of them. But yeah, this is basically the format where we're going to be talking about status updates on games. I'll be talking a little bit about the localization process behind our games and behind games in general. As you saw, sometimes I'll go off on a tangent and talk about Super Robot Wars for a couple minutes longer than I had anticipated. But yeah, so this is it. For the foreseeable future, you'll probably hear a lot about Embryo Machine. I mean, obviously, that's our game on Kickstarter right now. So you'll be hearing a lot of that. Hopefully you got some questions there. And yeah, so thanks everyone who joined us live, who jumped into the chat. Thanks everyone who asked questions through the Discord, through the Kickstarter page, and who reached out to us through social media. We love interacting with you all. I mean, the Discord sometimes is the highlight of my day, and I don't necessarily always get involved in the conversations, though I certainly did. I think on Friday when I think it was Ben and I who talked about mecha anime for way too long. Um, but even when I'm not directly engaging, I'm watching and I'm enjoying kind of seeing folks interact with one another. It's super cool. Community is really important to me. Um, playing tabletop games growing up, like community was a big part of that. Going to like Friday Night Magic, going to events like that were important to me. And so I'm really trying to do that with LionWing. I don't know if it's important to anyone else, but it's important to me. So I figured, why not? It's my company. I guess I'll just do what I want. But hopefully people are enjoying the Discord chat. And if you're not in the Discord, and if you're watching this on playback somewhere, please jump in the Discord. We're always talking about something. It may not always be like, it may not always be Embryo Machine right now, but it might be talking about where people order their collectibles from, or we might go on a tirade about what constitutes as a mecha anime and what does not. There have been some strong opinions just tonight on which shows constitute as a mecha anime and which should not. So there's always some kind of cool chatter going on, and of course there's lots of conversation happening about the games themselves. So I think that'll do it for this episode. Thanks everyone for listening. And again, we will be doing this every Wednesday night via Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. If you want to get hold of us before then, drop us a line on social. We are at LWing Publishing across the board. That's on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. You can find us at lionwingpublishing.com. You can find us here on Twitch, obviously. /LionWing_publishing is where you want to go for that. And right now you can find us on Kickstarter. Just search Embryo Machine, and there we will be. So thank you all, and I'll talk to you next time. Take care.